Okay, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you may be, across the nation or to all the ships at sea around the world. This is Russell Snyder, the Executive Director of the California Asphalt Pavement Association. We're welcoming you to this webinar on environmental product declarations. We're going to start the program in about 1 minute to give some late attendees time to log in and get settled in and get their coffee or whatever. So this is about a 1 minute check, and then we're going to begin the program in just a bit. So thank you for tuning in. Okay, hello again. This is Russell Snyder, Executive Director of the California Asphalt Pavement Association, and I will serve as the moderator for this special webinar on environmental product declarations in California. We have a distinguished panel of experts with us today who I will be introducing in just a moment. But first, a few announcements. This webinar is being recorded so that we may refer to the recording later for future educational opportunities. Also, electronic copies of the PowerPoint presentations delivered today will be made available electronically to anyone who has registered for this webinar and to others by request. Finally, everyone who is logged into this webinar will be muted so that disruption from ambient noise from our audience is minimized. If you would like to ask a question of one of the presenters, please type your question in the chat box near the bottom of your screen, and our other moderator, Brandon Milar, will read the question aloud near the end of the webinar, time permitting. Please indicate to whom the question should be directed to, or simply say all panelists if you are not sure. Finally, we ask that you take a few moments at the end of this webinar to give us some feedback on our webinar survey so we can continuously improve this way of delivering information. Now for some brief introductions. As I mentioned, my name is Russell Snyder, and I'm the Executive Director of the California Asphalt Pavement Association. Founded in 1953, CalAPA represents the asphalt pavement industry in California, including asphalt producers, refiners, paving contractors, emulsion suppliers, engineering firms, equipment manufacturers, and others who are part of the industry. I will serve as the webinar moderator today. Assisting me is CalAPA's Director of Technical Services, Mr. Brandon Milar. He's a registered civil engineer in the state of California and is a nationally recognized subject matter expert on asphalt pavements. Our presenters today are Dr. John Harvey, a professor of engineering and director of the University of California Pavement Research Center, Jackie Wong, a senior bridge engineer with the California Department of Transportation and point person for the deployment of EPDs at Caltrans for the Materials, Engineering, and Testing Services branch, and Joseph Shacat and Kelly Kanaras with the National Asphalt Pavement Association. Joseph is NAPA's Director of Sustainable Pavements, and Kelly is NAPA's Associate Director of Awards and Marketing. Now, a little bit about what will be covered today. Environmental Product Declarations, or EPDs, which seek to provide detailed information about a product's impact to the environment over its life cycle, continue to grow in prominence in California and nationally. Project owners increasingly are looking to EPDs to better understand how their projects and the materials used to build them may affect the environment and incorporate more sustainable choices into project decision making. The California Department of Transportation, or as we call it out here in California, Caltrans, intends to include EPD language in a few pilot projects to advertise in the spring of 2019. As part of our educational mission, the California Asphalt Pavement Association is pleased to partner with the National Asphalt Pavement Association, Caltrans, and the University of California Pavement Research Center to present this free educational webinar to help interested parties better understand what EPDs are and how they may impact your business or organization. While there may be some overlap of information by our presenters today, that is by design so that you can see how these various aspects of EPDs are interconnected. Dr. John Harvey will emphasize the research that has been going on globally and here in California with respect to EPDs, and Jackie Wong with Caltrans will discuss state legislation on EPDs and how the department is deploying EPDs on a pilot basis with asphalt pavements. Finally, our colleagues at NAPA, Joseph and Kelly, will also discuss the national implications and how the industry is incorporating aspects of EPDs and how we do business. A NAPA branded tool, the Emerald Echo label, has been developed for this purpose. Now it is time to introduce our first presenter, Dr. John Harvey. His PowerPoint slides will be displayed on your screen as he delivers his presentation. I should note that there are 5 reference documents that will also be displayed at the bottom of your screen for those who are participating in this webinar. And a PDF version of all the presentations delivered today are clickable and downloadable for you, as well as 2 other reference documents. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. John Harvey.
Thank you, Russell. So I'm going to try and give a little background on the who, what, why, and how of environmental product declarations. So what is an EPD, Environmental Product Declaration? It's more formally called a Type 3 Environmental Declaration under the International Standards Organization Standard 14025. The 1400 series of ISO primarily deals with environmental issues of all industrial products. An EPD is an environmental declaration providing quantified, and the key point is quantified environmental data using predetermined parameters. Basically, you don't get to make up what you're reporting. You need to state it, and everybody states the same thing. And where relevant, additional environmental information. But the key point about a Type 3 environmental declaration is it's quantifying, and it's quantifying against standard parameters. Those predetermined parameters are based on the 14040 series standards of ISO, which consist of 14040 and 14044. So a whole bunch of numbers, a whole bunch of ISO standards. You have to buy these, but if you really want to dig into this, take a look at these. These are not long documents, and they contain a lot of definitions. So a pavement has a life cycle. All products have a life cycle. Pavements have a somewhat more complicated life cycle. Civil infrastructure in general has a more complicated life cycle than, say, a light bulb or a baby diaper or a Coke bottle, which were actually the first types of products for which life cycle assessment was done in the 1960s. We have material extraction and production. We have transportation. So the end of materials acquisition and production is to the gate of the plant. We transport it to the construction site. We do construction. There's then interaction between the pavement and vehicles, pavement and the rest of the environment, called the use stage. We then do something with that pavement. We do periodically come back, do some maintenance and rehabilitation, preservation, and eventually we get to an end of life, which is typically for a civil infrastructure material like concrete or asphalt, going to be some sort of recycling, or potentially it goes to landfill. So that's the full life cycle. EPDs can cover the full life cycle. At this point, we're not doing that. Again, a pavement life cycle is much more complicated than a Coke bottle or a light bulb. The basic steps of life cycle assessment are goal definition and scope. This is where we define the questions to be answered. some sort of sustainability goals, and what are the boundaries of the system to be analyzed? What are we going to include in the quantification, and what are we specifically excluding from the quantification? The next step is to develop what's called the life cycle inventory. This is the basic beam counting, or in this case, input counting and output counting, where outputs are the emissions and the product that we're producing by the system. The next stage is to translate those emissions. We get the product, but we also get emissions and waste, and to translate the waste and emissions, as well as some of the inputs that involve resource and energy use, and translate those into what's the impact on humans, what's the impact on ecosystems, and what's the impact on the environment. Those then get interpreted. So basically that says we did the inventory, we did the impact. How do we then answer the questions that were posed in the goal statement based on those quantified results? And then a key part of this, if ISO states that if the information is to be consumed publicly distributed, it's not just used for internal process improvement, then it should go through a critical review where you have outside experts, both in your process experts and LCA experts, who review it and provide feedback and make sure it follows the standards. Some typical impact assessment categories are shown here. Some of those are pretty familiar. Global warming, which is a legislated thing in California, and some others. These translate into impacts to people, ecosystems, and depletion of finite resources. Most EPDs are using some subset of the Tracy impacts and potentially some of the impacts in the Federal Highways Life Cycle Assessment Framework. This is the FHWA Pavement Life Cycle Assessment Framework. This is basically International Standards Organization standards are generic for all industrial products. This guidance takes the ISO requirements and translates those into the peculiarities and the complexities of pavements, and makes recommendations about how to do life cycle assessment, including considerations for environmental product declarations. This was put together by the Federal Highway Sustainable Pavement Task Group, which is a resource I recommend folks take a look at, which involves federal highways, state DOTs, and all pavement industries, including materials industries and contractors. The what and why of EPDs, and I'm pulling this from an EPD tech brief that's going to be published by Federal Highways pretty soon. EPDs are standards used by producers to define the performance of the products. Just like we write an ASTM specification or an AASHTO specification, and we have specifications that define materials, and we have specifications that define tests and methods of quantifying the performance of those materials. An EPD is basically a specification for quantifying and reporting the environmental performance of a material. EPDs are published by the product manufacturers to communicate their potential environmental impacts of their products or processes. The ISO has established these life cycle assessment methods, as I mentioned, to declare EPDs, and this is the 14025 standard. Why EPDs? Well, prior to the move towards EPDs in North America, and EPDs have been used, or a form of them have been used really starting with the Netherlands about 20 years ago. The Netherlands is using this type of thing actually as a part of procurement for design-build projects. They're primarily design-build as opposed to our low-bid system here. And they actually turn those impacts into dollars and include them in the bid price. We're not going there, definitely not right now. And who knows in the future, Jackie will talk about that a little bit. But EPDs are a preferred method of communication because they provide a high level of confidence to the customers and other stakeholders that the production of the information and the organization of the information are following a standardized and transparent scientific process. What did we have prior to EPDs and prior to standardization of life cycle assessment? We have a lot of claims about the environment, usually narrow. You don't, because customer of the information doesn't necessarily know how that information was put together, where that information came from, and what methods were used to produce it. What happens if industry does not produce EPDs? Sorry, Brandon, I'm having a little trouble seeing what I'm doing.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, EPDs are, sorry, just a minute, technical difficulty here. EPDs are communication of verifiable environmental performance information, and the intention is to have a process and have information that's not misleading, and the goal of this is to stimulate a market-driven, fair and transparent process for continuous environmental improvement. If you're reporting and everybody's reporting the same, both internally within a company, you can make improvements, and externally, you're reporting what you're doing, and customers can benchmark you as well as you can benchmark yourself. The bottom line is people are environment, the public is interested in environmental performance, and your customers are interested in environmental performance. And the message I've been giving to industry is if you don't produce EPDs, somebody else is going to do a similar type of reporting for you, and they're going to do it the way they want and with whatever information that they have or that they can find. And you know so much more about your process than they do. So for the development of environmental product declarations, there's three main pieces. There's the product category rules. This is basically the set of specific rules and requirements for developing type 3 environmental product declarations for a specific category of products. This is how you do the rules for how you do the life cycle assessment, and the life cycle assessment is the process that I just talked about that you go through, and the EPD is the declaration of the results of the life cycle assessment, which again was performed using the specific rules for that type of product called the product category rule. So the steps that NAPA, that other industries in the pavement world have been gone through to develop the PCRs is a multi-step process. The first step is to put together a PCR proposal, create a draft version of it. They then need to engage with stakeholders, and the stakeholders include the manufacturers within the industry developing the PCR. Competing industries are invited to comment, and one of the goals eventually of PCRs is that across all pavement materials we have compatible PCRs. We're not quite there yet. We're going through the first generation. A few of the early pioneers in this are now getting ready for their second generation of PCRs. You invite LCA practitioners to make sure that they're following the requirements of ISO so that you can legitimately state that this follows ISO standards. Customers are invited as well, in this case primarily government agencies. The PCR is then subjected to critical review by the entire set of stakeholders, but it's also subjected to a formal critical review by a panel of outside critical reviewers, which that panel needs to include process experts, product experts, as well as LCA experts. Okay, once the PCR is put out, it gets produced. A program operator is designated for the PCR. The job of the program operator is to host the PCR, handle the updates, which are typically every 3 to 5 years, verify the EPDs that are produced under it. If they say produced under this PCR, they check that it actually does follow the product category rules, and they register the EPDs. In the United States right now, each industry sets up, operates, and chooses an operator for its own PCR and EPD program. As I mentioned, currently there are some differences in the U.S. between PCRs, both between industries, different pavement materials industries, different bridge material industries, but also within supply chains. For example, upstream producers of waste products may be claiming But if you use it in pavement and offset environmental impacts in the pavement, that upstream producer of some other product that had nothing to do with pavements may be claiming some of the environmental benefits of pavement industry using their stuff. These are the things that next generation, and I'll mention that at the end of the presentation, that we're working on to try and resolve. In Europe, there's generally a government coordinating committee, which if there's incompatibilities between PCRs, both laterally between industries and in a supply chain, they basically, as customers, sit on top of that and say, not good enough, not good enough. Okay, now you're close enough that you're matching up. We don't have that right now in North America. It's, again, another initiative that's underway in some different groups. So the LCA for the EPD, to publish an EPD, the LCA must first be developed for that product or group of CAT products, an initial LCA. It needs to follow the rules of the pertinent PCR. Often to get started, an industry group like NAPA, like National Ready Mix Concrete Association, PCA, now the Asphalt Institute is getting ready to produce EPDs. An industry group will conduct an initial national industry average or regional average LCA that uses typical values, not producer specific, but average values. That industry group then engages in an independent third party to perform the critical review and verify that initial broad LCA and the initial broad industry average EPD against the PCR. And once that's done, the average EPD is put out there. Then producers have the opportunity to deliver that average EPD for their mix design, and these can be tuned for each mix design using average upstream processes. Or that producer can say, I got better information than, or better process than the national average, and produce their own producer-specific EPD. So an EPD is basically like the nutrition label on a cereal box. It doesn't give you all the proprietary information upstream about the process. It just gives you the results. An LCA report is produced that gives some of the background. One of the key things about EPDs is it's a way to deliver this kind of information without giving up important proprietary information on the part of a producer. So I said the industry average LCA assembles all that information to produce the EPDs. And then individual companies can produce the EPDs for their plant-specific products using the national average processes, or they can go in and do their own LCA to not only have their own mix designs, but have their own background information. Now, one of the key points is that EPDs can only be produced for those stages of the life for which the EPD developer has information. So the final intention, say for a light bulb, is that you have the full life cycle of the light bulb. Because we are in a design bid build, low bid environment in California and in most of the United States, the producer of the EPD only knows what happens to the gate of the plant. Sometimes the producer is not the contractor. They don't know necessarily the whole life cycle. They're not designing the pavement. They're not maintaining the pavement. They don't control the life cycle. So the EPD that we're talking about today and the Caltrans specification are cradle to gate, which means the gate of the materials production plant, which is what we can do in a design bid build environment. In Europe, where much of the work is design build, they do a cradle to laid. So they include the materials production, the transportation to the site, and the construction process, and they can actually do this for the entire pavement structure or rehabilitation treatment because they control and know that information for that whole process. There is a possibility at some point, and this is what we're all still thinking about for pavements, can we ever get to a cradle to grave? I'll just put that out in the future for now. A couple quick definitions. You produce an EPD for a functional unit. So typically for asphalt, that's going to be a ton of asphalt. I think that's a NAPA functional unit. You normalize it for a specific, you state what the system boundaries are, what's the expected performance of the material, what performance specification it meets, like a type A hot mix asphalt in California. and it's cradle to gate for that. The process is the smallest element, so that the LCA and the building of this information comes from various unit processes which are defined in the life cycle assessment. That's where the actual figuring out, modeling what the inputs and outputs are occurring. I'm going to move a little faster here. There's some definitions in the presentation. The information that is put together for the LCA can consist of primary data. This is stuff you directly measure. It can be secondary data, which means information you get from other places. You can have specific data provided by one supplier for multiple plants or for a specific plant, or you can use average data where you're averaging across the entire industry. So LCAs and EPDs are put together using these different types of data. Right now in North America, a lot of this data comes from proprietary sources. One of the jobs of EPDs is to start getting better data into life cycle assessment for all purposes of design planning, etc. This is a somewhat complicated diagram. This is a process diagram for producing hot mix asphalt right here. And this is some of this is directly measured by the producers, their energy, their emissions, their waste. There's upstream processes. What's the asphalt binder that's going into this? That's a whole unit process. Where's my aggregate coming? That's a unit process. In this case, I'm doing a full depth reclamation, and I have cement going in there. So there's a whole cement process here. What do we do with EPDs? If I get an EPD now from the Asphalt Institute, or I get an EPD for cement, I don't have to model all of that information up there. I can just plug into my life cycle assessment the information from the EPD. So this is basically, the idea is to try and create a data-rich environment here, regionally specific, up-to-date data for life cycle assessment. Recommended stages for implementing EPDs, and this is where Caltrans is at, is developing the rules, requiring the reporting, moving towards standardization. Get it going, see how it's working, tune it up. At some point, this is off in the future for Caltrans, whether they take this into account in procurement. A key thing before you ever go to procurement is you have to make sure that you're accounting for equivalent performance. So a quick last up, what's coming up? Asphalt Institute's producing a binder EPD. It's coming out in 2019. I'll let Jackie talk about what's happening with Caltrans. There is a push to get better data to be used in EPDs through what's called the Federal Life Cycle Assessment Commons, and it's putting together basic standards for EPDs and life cycle assessment data across all federal agencies. Pavement, being kind of out in the forefront of LCA, is the pilot project. Movement towards a single PCR, and then what are we going to do with these EPDs? Well, there's tools under development. Federal Highways is developing a tool. We have a California-specific tool, not an official Caltrans tool, I want to emphasize that, but we have a California-specific tool. There are other tools. The next step is to have LCA tools to use these in. In the presentation are a bunch of references, and some of these I think are posted as handouts, and those are there. If you want more information, there's going to be a LCA conference coming back to Davis in 2020 to California. Thanks, and pass it on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harvey. That's my cheesy little sound effect thing. And that was meant to replicate the applause sound. For those of you on the phone, we have, as I understand it, more than 100 people logging into today's presentation. Just as a reminder, if you have a question for Dr. Harvey, please type it in the chat box, and we will get to as many of the questions as time permits near the end of this webinar. Also, it's our intention to capture all the questions and supply written answers, and then send that as a follow-up to everybody who registered for this webinar. So anyway, so now it's my pleasure to introduce Jackie Wong with the California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans, to discuss what the department is doing with regard to EPDs and asphalt. Take it away, Jackie.
Thank you, Russ. Hello again, my name is Jackie, and I work with our Materials Engineering and Testing Services subdivision, also referred to as METS. I am currently managing a team comprised of members from several Caltrans divisions, including construction, pavement program, sustainability, environmental analysis, to name a few. And I'll be providing you with an update on what we're doing on the EPD landscape. So, why are we here today? First, I'll cover a bit of the why we want to collect EPDs, then try to give you a lay of the land with a roadmap that attempts to connect what's going on with current legislation on EPDs and then how that connects to Caltrans pilot projects, as well as give you a sense of where we're trying to go with EPDs. I'll cover a bit of where we are in terms of developing our pavement lifecycle assessment tools, and most importantly, how all of the department's efforts on EPDs affects you. So why are we interested? Well, first of all, we want to collect data, first and foremost. Data collection for benchmarking. It's the new year, and we want to lose a ton of carbon dioxide without knowing how much we're consuming. So we need to measure. So before we analyze and improve our environmental impacts, we must measure them. And then policy and legislation. So on a state level, going down a few bullets, Assembly Bill 32 of 2006 is when California established greenhouse gas emission reduction targets to reduce our emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. And that represents a 15% reduction from a business as usual model. And then further, to reduce our emissions to 80% below those 1990 levels by 2050. So that's about 3 decades away. All state agencies with jurisdiction over sources of emissions were required to implement measures to hit these targets. And then a follow-up to that, Executive Order B 3015, that set interim reduction targets between 2020 and 2050. So kind of just set goals every 10 years to make sure that we were hitting that. Further, the California Transportation Plan 2040 lays out the long-term goals and policies in regards to sustainability. And then while the 5-year strategic management plan then goes on to lay out performance measures and targets, such as for example, an 80% reduction from our 2010 nitrous oxide levels in 2023 in the South Coast air quality basin. So just to give you an example, it's getting more and more specific towards what our state goals are. And then within Caltrans, there have been directors' policies on climate change and sustainability, essentially requiring its workforce to incorporate greenhouse gas reduction strategies into its everyday operations, and that includes project delivery. And then the most recent piece of legislation, which I'm sure you're all interested in, and directly tied to EPDs, is the California Assembly Bill 262, also known as the Buy Clean California Act. Okay, so the Buy Clean California Act. It was first drafted in early 2017 and signed into law in October of that year. Then it was further amended in June 2018 to provide a 2-year phase-in period, among other things. So on the left of the screen is what we are considering eligible materials. Throughout the initial versions of the bill, there were other materials considered for the legislation, but ultimately these were removed, and these are the 4 that remained. On the right side of the screen is the timeline set forth by the legislation. I should mention that I will likely use GWP, global warming potential, greenhouse gas, and carbon dioxide interchangeably, but generally they all relate back to something equivalent to a carbon dioxide emission. So where we are today is that all projects statewide currently have contract language requesting EPDs for these 4 eligible materials. And then starting in 2020, that will become a requirement. And then further, in 2021, a GWP baseline will be set, at which point suppliers of these eligible materials must fall below that baseline. So other state agencies that are also required to comply and fall under the Public Contract Code include Department of Water Resources, Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CSU, UC, RESD, the Real Estate Division of DGS, Parks and Rec, and there's a few more. All this can be found on the California DGS website, which is reachable from the METS website, which I will share with you later in this presentation. So unless you are supplying any of the materials listed here, AB 262 does not currently apply to you. So, moving on. So, potential uses for EPDs. So it was early 2016 when Caltrans started to take interest in collecting EPDs on its most used materials for the purposes of life cycle assessment. AB 262 eventually beat us to it before we could collect a single EPD and mandated their collection, at least for the eligible materials. So now what will we do with them? Like I said before, we want to benchmark and inform. So we are collecting data for those eligible materials, and we also want to collect for additional materials. One more, going back to AB 262, we will be collecting the data and reporting that to DGS, since they are the lead agency on reporting back to the legislature. So aside from that, EPDs provide a great deal of environmental impact information that Caltrans can use for benchmarking on materials used statewide. That information feeds into full life cycle assessment so that Caltrans can look at what we build and not just what we build with. So while we own a lot of the data from construction phase through maintenance and end of life to things like equipment diaries, rehab cycles, vehicle miles traveled, you, the suppliers, own the data for the product stage. And so we really rely on you for that assistance. So now, aside from AB 262, Caltrans is continuing its work on collecting EPDs for the materials it uses the most of. And that includes aggregate, concrete, and then asphalt concrete. So everything has a roadmap. So there's a lot of different EPD efforts going on. This roadmap tries to capture all of the different items and how Caltrans is interfacing between them. So between administering the law and continuing to progress on our department goals, both efforts ultimately get us to the goal of collecting EPDs for the useful life cycle assessment. So on the left side, you've got everything related to Buy Clean California Act, the legislation. The green and blue boxes are the additional materials that we want to collect for Caltrans products. And then at the bottom, you'll see a little box, how all of this plugs in and feeds into life cycle assessment. So right now, in terms of EPDs, we're here around phase 2, administering our requests for EPDs of eligible materials to comply with AB 262. And then for our pilot projects, collecting EPDs for the additional materials that Caltrans is interested in. And currently, we have 5 pilot projects identified and expect more to be added through 2019. And we'll show you how to get there later in this presentation. Additionally, in the background, you can see that there is a green Now box for existing and new LCA information. Caltrans is also currently working on a national level to develop LCA resources, the other parts of the life cycle. So we can roll up all the data at the end of this, plug in all the parts that are missing, and look at the entire life cycle of a product, whether it's a pavement or a structure. And currently, as John alluded to, Pavement is much farther ahead in terms of developing its tools that will likely be the first customers for EPDs. So this is just a snippet from our Pavement LCA roadmap. Right now, we are in the implementation phase, looking for suitable pilot projects, incorporating the non-standard special provision for EPDs. Our goal is to run about 20 pilot projects throughout the state. Like I mentioned, we had about 5 already set. This is a learning process, so as we continue to collect EPDs, we will be refining that process, taking lessons learned and continuing to define the methodology of how we collect EPDs. There's this red box around here, and these are all decision bubbles regarding procurement. This is something Caltrans is considering. At this time, we are not quite ready yet because we haven't even collected our first EPD, but developing the approach on how and if we use EPDs in procurement. So that industry will play a big role in determining how we use EPDs towards furthering our Caltrans sustainability goals. So outside of that red box, what we will use those EPDs for is feeding it into pavement lifecycle assessment. So some of the items and tools that John had alluded to, like ELCAP, trying to take what we can get from EPDs and plug that into a full lifecycle assessment. So going back. And one potential of using life cycle assessment is, this is a very schematic graph, but you could say that your blue line alternative one could be, I don't know, a rubberized HMA that's 10 foot deep, and the red one could be your regular HMA, I don't know, a 4 foot slab, hypothetically speaking. So the purpose of life cycle assessment is that in the build phase, maybe one has a higher greenhouse gas emission or life cycle environmental impact. But as you look to the life of that pavement, maybe one has more rehab cycles, or it's more difficult or more intensive. And at the end of this, alternative 2 beats out alternative 1. So that's just a very schematic of what we can do with EPDs when we plug that into the full life cycle assessment. So how will Caltrans collect EPDs? We work through our specifications, and so this would be something you could find in Section 6, Control of Materials. It will include EPD requirements for both the Buy Clean California Act and pilot project materials. So any projects that are let out today, you will see that there is a special provision in Section 6, and that is for compliance with the Buy Clean California Act. Any pilot projects will have that standard special provision removed, and there will be a non-standard special provision to collect EPDs for all 7 materials. The 4 that are part of the legislation, and these 3 for aggregate, asphalt, concrete, and concrete. What is different from the pilot projects is that they will have their own lump sum bid item. So if there is a cost there, we want you to go ahead and bid it. So essentially, Caltrans is saying that we will pay for them on these pilot projects. Additionally, you'll notice that there is a quantity threshold. So we've chosen pilot projects that we believe meet those quantity thresholds. And so for job mix formulas, there is a minimum there for 1,000 tons per mix design. And then this will be anything that is caught by Section 39-2, hot mix asphalt. For more information, visit the MET's website. You can go to Contractor and Supplier Resources. First tab on there is Environmental Product Declarations. You can find more information about Assembly Bill 262, what we're doing with pilot projects. There are some handouts, copies of the SSP and the NSSP, PCR information on where to go, what to follow, and then also the listing of the pilot projects. And that will continue to be updated as we add more projects. How will we collect the EPDs? Everything will be done electronically via DIME, our Data Interchange for Materials Engineering. So if you've ever inputted JMF information or looked up an aggregate source or any other type of material test data, if you're familiar with that, it should be a very straightforward process. Go to the DIME website, register, and there's a little tab at the top that says Submit Your EPD. From there, you have to select your project. If you've ever submitted a 3101 on a Caltrans project, your vendor information is already on there, and you can submit your EPD for that facility. If not, there are steps to take to get you in, but that's how we're collecting them. And so all of that information will be collected through DIME, and then on our end, Caltrans, we can take that information, report it back to DGS for AB 262, and then also communicate with pavement lifecycle assessment tools. All right, so summaries and takeaways. These pilot projects will provide knowledge on compliance and how to obtain and manage EPD data prior to statewide implementation. We do want to take this statewide. We do need to make sure we work out of the bugs and that this is something that we can administer and that is achievable with all of our industry partners and other stakeholders. Aggregate, asphalt, concrete, and concrete EPD pilot projects will start advertising in spring 2019. And we'll continue to see more projects be added to the pipeline through the end of the year. EPD data will be submitted electronically through DIME. EPDs support life cycle assessment for our transportation assets. So we're not just taking data and sitting on it. We want to send it into other tools and resources so that we can make better decisions as a department in terms of what we build. And then last and most important, go to the MET's website to navigate EPDs on Caltrans projects. That will be our primary mode of communication. So we'll try to send any updates, pertinent information through that way. Thank you for your time today.
Wow. Thank you, Jackie. Here we go. There we go. My cheesy, stop. My cheesy 99-cent sound replicator there. Okay. Just a reminder, if you have any questions for Jackie, please enter it into the chat box, and we will do our best to get to those questions near the end of this webinar. And I'm stalling as my technical assistant, who wears many hats, including IT, junior IT guy, is going to be handing off control to our friends and colleagues at Napa, who are going to be handling, that's Joseph and Kelly, and they're going to be handling the next part of this webinar. Technology is quite amazing. For those of you, I'm dating myself, you remember the old TV show, The Outer Limits, where you would turn your control of your TV over to somebody else. So it looks like Joseph and Kelly, are you online?
We are.
Okay, very good. And I think the screen is now displaying your screen, correct?
It looks like it.
Okay. With that, I'm going to turn the program over to our folks at Napa back in Maryland. Take it away, Joseph and Kelly.
Okay, thanks a lot, Russ, for setting this up. This has been a really good presentation so far. So Kelly and I are going to talk about Emerald Eco Label. This is Napa's EPD program for asphalt mixtures. So I want to start off with a brief introduction of who is Napa. Napa is the only trade association that represents exclusively the interests of the asphalt paving industry at a national level. Our membership consists primarily of mixed producers and paving contractors. We also represent the equipment suppliers, material suppliers, engineers, and consultants who serve the industry. Some of our activities include research and engineering related to asphalt pavements. In this area, we work extensively with Federal Highways Administration and academia. We also offer world-class member services, including educational training, meetings, and awards programs. And we represent the industry before the Congress regarding highway and airport investment funding legislation, and in front of regulatory agencies such as EPA and OSHA. We help advance the interests of the industry. So enough about Napa, let's get on to our EPD program. John went over some of the basic components of an EPD, and I'm going to go through these with a little more detail on how it works for asphalt. Starting with the PCR, the product category rules, moving on to the life cycle assessment, and then finally the environmental product declaration. With the PCR, as John mentioned, this defines your inputs, system boundaries, life cycle stages, and what kind of data are going to be reported in the EPD. For asphalt mixtures, Napa decided to become the program operator because we felt like, one, we wanted to draft the PCR or run the program because we know the asphalt industry at least as well as anyone else out there, and we didn't want someone else defining these things for us. So we took a proactive approach. The PCR development went through an independent and public review process. It was finalized in 2017, and so the PCR is valid for 5 years through January of 2022. A couple of the things in the PCR that's important. It defines what makes EPDs comparable. How can you compare the EPD for one mix with another? And as John mentioned, they have to meet similar performance criteria. So you wouldn't want to compare a driveway mix to a highway mix because they have different performance criteria. So that's laid out in the PCR. Our declared unit is 1 short ton of asphalt mixture. So all the environmental impacts are reported in units per ton of asphalt, essentially. The PCR defines which data are primary or site-specific and which data are secondary or upstream. And for the upstream data, it specifies public databases for upstream products and processes. And this is a little unique to our industry compared to other PCRs that I've seen, in that using public databases, one, ensures that the data is publicly available and can be readily reviewed and doesn't cost an arm and a leg for someone to purchase if they want to look at the data and use it for other purposes. And also by specifying exactly which databases for which data sets, it ensures that any EPD that's produced under this PCR, even if it's produced by someone other than NAPA, they should be ultimately comparable with respect to how they handle the upstream data and what kind of assumptions are put into that. The life cycle assessment was conducted by Dr. Amlan Mukherjee. He's a professor at Michigan Tech University. He was in residence here at NAPA for a year while he worked on this. He did an industry-wide survey of 50 asphalt plants across the country, and he visited almost all of them as part of the process of collecting data. The LCA serves as essentially the scientific basis for the Emerald Eco, the EPD tool. The LCA went through its own independent review process as well. The scope of our EPD is cradle to gate. John again mentioned this. That means it covers materials, extraction and processing of materials such as aggregates, asphalt binder, additives, and energy sources as well. Covers transportation of those materials to the asphalt plant, and then plant operations. We stuck with these three life cycle stages because they're the ones that a mixed producer has direct control over. And going beyond that is, for a mixed producer, speculative as to what, how the material is going to be placed, how it's going to be used, and maintenance intervals and that sort of thing. One of the things that's clearly identified in our PCR and the LCA and in the EPDs is data gaps. So one of the few disadvantages of using public databases for upstream data is they don't really have good information at this point in time on a lot of additives that are used in asphalt. So things like liquid anti-strips, recycling agents, war mix additives, ground tire rubber, and polymers, we don't have data on them essentially. If your mix includes one of these materials, that will be noted in the EPD that there are data gaps. That doesn't mean that the EPD is invalid. The EPD is perfectly valid still, but the data gap will be noted. John mentioned the steps to produce an EPD, and these are the steps that we went through. We started by selecting the program operator, which was ourselves. We commissioned an LCA study of our product, which was done by Dr. Mukherjee. We developed a PCR committee, and we made all the relevant decisions we had to in committee. The draft PCR was reviewed by outside experts, and an open public comment period as well. The final PCR was published. We conducted the LCA and drafted the EPD. We had the EPD reviewed by an expert, and these two steps are really the costly parts of the whole process. And then you can publish your reviewed EPD. This whole process took us about 3 years and cost over $130,000 to conduct. So knowing that sort of level of effort and investment is unreasonable or wouldn't be expected for most asphalt plants around the country, especially considering a lot of the companies that run asphalt plants maybe own 1 or 2 or 3 plants. So it's a pretty hefty ask for a company that just has a couple of plants. So what we did is we took all this information and put it into a simple, easy to use online system called Emerald Eco Label. And using this system, using this tool, the process for mixed producers to develop an EPD is quite simple. One, you compile your plant-specific and mix-specific data. You purchase access for your plant on our website, which is pretty inexpensive, and then you upload your data into the tool. A lot more straightforward than the previous slide. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, who's going to talk a little bit about the tool itself.
Okay, thanks, Joseph. So like Joseph said, the preparation of the PCR, the LCA, the EPD information, all of that went into creating NAPA's own Emerald Eco-Label tool. And basically what the tool does is it takes a process that's very long, very time-consuming and very costly, and it puts it into an easy-to-use online program that produces EPDs for asphalt mixtures. This tool can be used for any plant located in the U.S., and it substantially saves time and money in the process. So what is the tool? The tool is web-based, which means it can be used on any device, anywhere, as long as you have an internet connection. It's important to note that the software is hosted by a third party. NAPA does not host the software used to create the EPDs. And the reason that we elected to go that route is to protect the confidentiality of your mix design data. Even NAPA does not see your inputs on when creating the EPDs or your mix design data. The tool is inexpensive, it's very easy to use, and the results can be printed easily and output as a PDF that you can share with your customer. I get asked a lot how long it takes to actually create an EPD. The input that I've received from several people that have used it have said that, you know, on a part-time basis, it took them anywhere between 1 to 2 weeks to do it, to do their first one, and that means they needed to set up the plant and all the input data for the plant. And then their subsequent EPDs took them maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes to do. We, of course, held beta tests here in the office, and producers walked out of the office having created an EPD in about 6 hours, you know, working steadily nonstop. So it is very fast. As was mentioned by John and by Joseph, you're going to be entering 2 types of data when you're setting up your EPDs. The first type of data is primary data, and that's entered by you. And this is plant-specific data. You're going to be entering your fuel usage, your electricity consumption, the tons of asphalt produced at that plant, water, things along that nature. And that's when you set up your actual plant. When you go to enter your actual mix and produce an EPD for a specific mix, then you're going to be entering your binder content, wrap, additives, distance from material suppliers, all that sort of things. These EPDs are plant-specific and they're product-specific for each mix design. We do have a data collection spreadsheet that is housed on the NAPA website, and I'll get to where that is a little bit later. Collection process of all the data that you need to input the EPD, and again, the data inputs are completely confidential. This is what a produced EPD looks like. It's completely customizable. As you can see, you know, it's got company-specific information, plant-specific information, and it shows you, you know, the life cycle and then all of your outputs. One thing that's really important to note is that these EPDs for asphalt mixtures cannot be compared to EPDs of concrete mixtures. For an EPD to be comparable, it has to be created using the same underlying PCR. So this is an example of the output that you would get. I'm going to turn it over to Joseph again for another minute or so.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a couple of things here, looking at some of the outputs. So there's a couple of tables in the output EPD, and one of them looks like this. It's the environmental impacts under Tracy, which John mentioned. And on the left side is the impact categories, the first one there being global warming or global warming potential or greenhouse gas or carbon footprint or whatever you want to call it. They're all essentially the same. And on the right are the 3 life cycle stages that are covered in the EPD, A1 being materials, A2 being transportation, and A3 being mixed production. And just by looking at the first impact category on global warming, you can see that the bulk of the impact for this particular example happens to be in the mixed production stage. So if you wanted to optimize your mix or your plant operations to reduce or minimize the carbon footprint of the mix, you can see that your biggest bang, your most opportunity there is probably with the plant operations. Maybe by switching fuels or using more wrap, or doing some other stockpile management with covering wrap piles and that sort of thing to reduce moisture. You could work on things that would improve your carbon footprint. The second thing for this particular plant, in this example, you might look at your material stage, and that might be, you might be able to look at things in your product supply chain as far as optimizing from that perspective. And then if this plant looks like it's probably located on site at a quarry because the transportation impact is pretty low. But if you're at a different kind of location where you're shipping in aggregates from a foreign country, for instance, which is not uncommon in California, then that A2 might be substantially higher. So I just wanted to kind of mention that this is a way to look at the life cycle stages of your products and of your plant operations and figure out how to optimize them. And I should also note that engineers and consultants working for owners on LEED projects are already doing this sort of thing in specifying the products and the mixture of products, especially related to concrete, where I've seen that people are looking at this and trying to optimize the environmental impacts of product selections and mix designs. Some of the benefits, as I just mentioned, you can evaluate your plant operations and your supply chains to optimize sustainability. You can quantify environmental improvements of your products over time. So you can run an EPD on your current mix design, and then maybe you update that mix design or you improve your plant operations. Over time, you can run this similar EPD on that different mix of the same type, and you can quantify that improvement. This may provide new marketing opportunities if you want to position your company as being green or sustainable. It's definitely a way of showing that you're willing to disclose the environmental aspects of your impacts of your mix designs of your operations. And probably most importantly for this webinar, users of this program can meet requirements under the Caltrans EPD policy and also meet the requirements within green rating systems such as LEED, Envision, and others. I should mention all the major green rating systems in their latest updates have EPDs as a credit category for collecting points. So some of your customers may be requesting EPDs for LEED projects where they're doing a parking lot associated with the building or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'll just add also to that I have already received an email from a LEED consultant in California. They're working on a major airport project, and he was asking me for listing of preferred contractors, i.e. contractors that have already produced EPDs so that they can get LEED certification on that airport project. So how to get started. Everything you could possibly want to know about how to use the Emerald Ecolabel tool is at asphaltpavements.org/EPD. One of the tabs there is registration process, tells you everything you need to know. The big thing is you're going to have to choose a designated primary contact for your company. This person is kind of like the coach of a sports team. They are assigning users and players. They're explaining all the rules, and they're responsible for training everybody who's going to use the tool. The tool does allow that primary contact to assign other users either to input plant information or to input mix design information to be able to edit. That primary contact is really important, and that person only is responsible for watching 2 free webinars and passing the related quizzes. The first webinar basically explains what EPDs are, kind of the whole process behind EPDs, and the second one is really important. It shows you everything you need to know about specifically how to use the Emerald Ecolabel tool with detailed instructions on there. After you watch and pass the quizzes, I will provide you access to the tool that allows you to move on in the process. You would register on the Emerald Ecolabel website, and then you purchase access for your plants. As far as the cost is concerned, because this is not a type of tool where you get access for 5 years or 3 years or whatever, no matter when you sign up, but the expiration is instead completely tied to the expiration of the PCR. The scale for the cost changes year by year. So this year, members are going to cost $900. Non-member rate is $1,050. Everybody's EPDs and access to the tool are going to expire on January 31st, 2022, no matter when you sign up. If you sign up on January 31st, 2021, you get access for 1 day, which should be very helpful. Anyway, we've got plenty of time, I think, to handle questions, but here are our contacts here at NAPA in case you have questions after this webinar is over. Please direct any technical questions over to Joseph. Any kind of program questions, how to sign up for the tool, cost of the tool, things like that, you can direct towards me. With that, I'll turn it back over to Russell.
Okay.
That's the real thing.
That's awesome. We had some people in our conference room here. They're actual real live people clapping as opposed to my cheesy 99-cent sound effect thing. Okay. Thank you very much, Joseph and Kelly. And thank you to all our presenters for staying to time. I know that's a real challenge, especially with a real complicated topic, subject matter such as this. Now with that, I'm going to turn to my right to Brandon Milar, our Director of Technical Services and IT support person. He has new duties. And to see what questions that folks have entered in on the chat box. We'll be happy to try to get to as many of those questions and as we can. And Brandon is shrugging, so that's not a good sign. And what we'll do just for this format is we'll read a question, and then whoever feels like they perhaps, if they didn't direct the question to a specific presenter, we'll throw it open to all the presenters that are on this call, and then anybody who wants to answer the question they can. We would ask that you just identify yourself before you provide an answer. So, okay, Brandon, go ahead with our first question.
All right. Probably question will go to Jackie. Would an EPD be required for different pavement designs? For example, a 3/4-inch rubber gap braided mix with no wrap versus a standard 1/2-inch dense braided mix with 15% wrap.
So the way that it is now, whatever is in the plans is what the EPD will be required for. So we're not changing the design after a bid. All of this life cycle assessment, this is everything that's happening behind the scenes before Caltrans even puts something out to bid. So whatever is in the plans is what the EPD would represent.
If I can jump in, from a NAPA side, yes, each new mix design is going to have a different environmental impact. Rubberized binder has a different impact than conventional binder, than polymer modified. And adding wrap definitely will cut your environmental impact. So you need an EPD for each mix design. Concrete plant with 100 mix designs, 200 mix designs are producing 200 EPDs.
And as a follow-up on that, Jackie, in the event you're in the middle of a project and there is a change to mix design, then is the EPD required to be updated with those changes? If
it still meets those minimum quantities for those pilot projects, we would ask a new EPD to be produced.
So, John, how many EPDs would that be for the concrete folks?
Some of the concrete folks have hundreds.
Okay, hold on a second. I have a special sound effect for that. Okay. All right. Somebody said I overpaid for my 99-cent sound effect thing.
Now, Russell, we want to see what else is on there.
There's 16 different buttons.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm here all week. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Brandon.
Question number 2. Is the state considering any cold-in-place recycling or full-depth reclamation projects as pilot projects for the EPD program?
There could be. The trigger for those pilot projects is to have enough quantities of those Section 39 materials. It makes it a little easier for us to administer. So there could be, but essentially it's the EPDs for the hot mixes.
Looking ahead, CIR, FDR, CCPR, any other things that industry comes up with, these in-place recycling methods start to blur that line about where's the gate, because so much of the process is actually on the site. So this is the kind of thing that's being discussed by the Federal Highway Sustainable Pavements Task Group. And I'm expecting that the FHWA LCA framework will need to be updated during this contract to more explicitly consider this, where the lines between the gate change, particularly with in-place recycling.
All right. Question number 3, two-parter. Are EPDs expected to vary significantly from one asphalt supplier to another, or will most HMA suppliers ultimately have similar EPDs for similar HMA products?
I would say that's one of the things that everybody's interested in finding out. If somebody found a better way to skin the cat, and that's kind of the market-driven idea, is if we're all benchmarking and we're all going to see our, you show me your numbers, I'll show you mine, because they're going to be out there in the end. That's where you start getting incentivized to, can we do better?
Yeah, and just to add to that, this is Joseph.
Yeah, go ahead, Joseph.
We've been able to see some of the EPDs that some of our users have started to produce. They're not publishing them at this point, but they've been kind of working with their plants and their mixed data and that sort of thing. And I can say that there are substantial differences between different plants across the country, even within the same state, from one mix to another. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I'll add, in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands and now France, where this is actually a part of procurement, plants spend a lot of time going through their processes and trying to figure out, how can we save more energy? How can we, where's our hot spots in our processes, and how do we improve our processes? And in many cases, this also cuts their costs. So this is basically a cost and a environment. They often go hand in hand. They seldom work against each other.
I have a sound effect for that. Okay. Very good. I got my 99 cents worth on that thing. Okay.
Will Caltrans only be evaluating cradle to gate EPDs for non-BCCA materials from suppliers and contractors?
BCCA?
By Clean California Act.
Right.
Yes, we are only collecting cradle to gate EPDs for the non-BCCA materials, which is the aggregate, asphalt, concrete, and the concrete.
Jackie, this is Russ Snyder. I wonder if you could maybe just give a quick, brief summary of what the Buy Clean California Act is, so the folks on the phone who may not be familiar with it understand what it is.
That is Assembly Bill 262.
Okay, all right.
So
that was in your presentation.
I will also use those interchangeably. BCCA, Buy Clean California Act, AB 262. It was amended, and so that Assembly Bill is 1817, or legislation on EPD. It's the only piece right now.
Okay, thank you.
We already know that greenhouse gas fumes and emissions are dramatically reduced when we produce warm mix asphalt in lieu of hot mix asphalt. Has anyone created comparative EPDs for identical HMA and WMA mixes to more accurately capture these warm mix asphalt benefits?
I can answer that. This is Joseph. It's a really good question, and the answer isn't as straightforward as you'd want it to be. One of the issues with our program is that the way you enter your data for the plant is you enter a year's worth of data for the plant, and then how many tons of mix did you produce over the course of that year. And then the energy associated with the plant operations is attributed to the mix on a per ton basis irrespective of whether it's hot mix or warm mix. We've been trying to think of a way to capture the energy savings in warm mix, but it becomes a data collection challenge. So the only way you could really identify that is if you had data from a year before you did hot mix, before you did warm mix, and then you started implementing warm mix or increasing the amount of warm mix that you're running in the plant, you should see the average energy consumption go down, but you wouldn't see that in a mix design for one mix versus another mix based on the same kind of plant data. So it's a limitation for sure. We're aware of that issue. The solution is not straightforward and it's not simple from a data collection standpoint, but we're aware of it.
I would add on top of that, this is one of the things that we've discussed a number of times in the FHWA task group and thinking about it. Just because we use warm mix for different purposes. Sometimes we use it during hot weather and we can reduce our temperature, but just because I put warm mix in there doesn't necessarily mean that I'm reducing my mix temperature, because I may be trying to get some cold weather paving, I may have a long haul distance. So the approach that Napa has, looking at the overall energy usage, really provides a much more verifiable measure of how much energy that plant is using. And if you are reducing energy consumption to heat the mix, that will show up. Now, there's a little bit of a lag time, as Joseph was saying, but to say and certify that I'm using warm mix and I get this energy benefit, there would need to be a method to verify that you're actually dropping the temperature using warm mix, and that's a major compliance issue.
Thank you. Brandon has our next question.
Are there any Caltrans guidelines on what minimum EPD scores are satisfactory or passing?
So two parts to that. So for the Assembly Bill 262, also known as Buy Clean California Act, that responsibility lies with Department of General Services. They are ultimately responsible for setting what that baseline acceptable global warming limit is. There's more information on their proposed methodologies on their website, which you can get to from our website, or you could probably Google AB 262 and GGS and find it as well. So they have a methodology proposed that satisfactory or baseline value for each material is not required to be set until January of 2021. So now for the Caltrans side, remember, we're looking at full life cycle assessment. So we are collecting the information on EPDs, but we have not yet determined if we can use them, if the data quality is there on the EPDs and across the board between different materials, on how best to use them in procurement, if we get to that point. So as we collect more information, hopefully we kind of work out something that may be in the best interest of both industry and us. So whether it's a way to incentivize or it could be setting a baseline if that works. But we do understand California reaches 12 different districts, different environments, different types of contractor environments, and so we know one size fits all does not usually fit all. So it will be a discussion that we will continually have for the upcoming year or years.
From a national level, kind of some initial thinking is that the approach, and just to emphasize, AB 262 does not cover asphalt, concrete, or aggregate. Yes. Only if there's a plate glass manufacturer on the line, are you and structural steel are you applicable? Insulating wool. At a national level, from a design bid build, a low bid environment, kind of the initial thing, and this is just unofficial update. Initial thinking is that setting a baseline is extremely difficult for the reasons that Jackie laid out, particularly in a place as diverse as California. and that something along the lines of incentive disincentives might be the way to go. That industry is much more familiar with. This, or dare I say, its smoothness, compaction, a couple other things. We're used to it, and in design, bid, and build environment, that might be the way to go. Totally unofficial, and this is just current thinking.
One more. This looks like the last question. If anyone has any questions, type them really quick. But on this question, it's pretty straightforward. Russ, you can handle this. Are you able to email me a copy of the presentations from today?
No, I'm not. So
Okay.
too bad. So sad. No, I'm just. Okay. Very good. All right. No, we are going to send a follow-up email to everybody that registered for this webinar with a link to all the presentations that were delivered today, and hopefully other helpful information, as well as the meeting evaluation. We would appreciate if you take a few moments to do that. So we apologize if anybody had any technical difficulties. We did embed the presentations in the webinar. They were supposed to also be available for your download during this webinar, but we will send them also afterwards so you can access them. If anybody wants to see them right now, a quick way to get them is our website is calapa.net. That's CALAPA.net. And then in the middle of the page where it says what's new, about the third link down, it says click here for technical presentations delivered at CalAPA events. And then that's our SlideShare page, and all of our presentations delivered at all of our events are there and available for you to download. So.
Okay. Another question, is there an effort being made to compare asphalt EPDs to concrete EPDs to optimize material selection for future heavy highway projects?
There is effort to compare asphalt life cycle assessment to concrete life cycle assessment. These things are already happening kind of behind the scenes before you even see what gets put into a set of plans. So I think also what John alluded to earlier was that there are some overarching PCR requirements on comparability, and so that is something that you would not do, is to compare an asphalt EPD to a concrete EPD, because they have completely different life cycle assessments and they're different that serve different purposes. So if you remember that graph that was on one of my slides that kind of gave a hypothetical of two different products, that one alternative one could be a concrete pavement, alternative two could be asphalt pavement. But remember that it takes the entire life cycle into effect. So how long it lasts, the impacts of building it, all the rehab cycles, the vehicle interaction, all of that is taken into account. And so eventually those tools will go into what exactly Caltrans decides and plans to build before it even reaches a set of plans for bid.
Let's add to that that life cycle cost analysis is not going away and will always be one of the major drivers looking to long-term ideas to bring in environmental, but life cycle cost analysis is the major driver still.
Yeah. So I mean, there's need, there's cost, and environmental impacts is just one additional consideration in terms of what Caltrans puts into our transportation system.
Is that it? Okay. Thank you, Brandon, for your assistance in reading those questions, and I appreciate that. It appears that we are approaching the end of our allotted time for this webinar. I'm so sad. It was so outstanding. We would like to take this opportunity to once again thank our distinguished panel of subject matter experts who joined us on the webinar today, and also thank all of you who have attended. We hope you have found this webinar to be informative. As a reminder, please take a moment to give us your feedback on this webinar, and also feel free to suggest topics for future webinars. We will be sending a follow-up email with a link to a brief survey and also the link to the presentations delivered today. So you'll be receiving those shortly. On behalf of the CalAPA Board of Directors, our agency partners, our distinguished panels, and others who helped put this program together, thank you again. Feel free to contact us at CalAPA if you have any questions or need additional information. This concludes this webinar.